Once you start connecting to shorebirds, once you start working with them, two things happen. The first is that you start to see how interconnected the globe is. And you start to be captured by the elegance of it, the complexity, the beauty of something that's so fragile that it just compels you to want to do something, to protect it, to safeguard it, like as though you saw this beautiful glass object and you don't want to see it broken. And then that leads you to the second thing, which is that there are a lot of people who felt the same way that I do. And so you start working with people from all over the globe. You know, unfortunately, we're caught in these a sort of running series of battles that we have to constantly confront people who want to break that glass, that fragile glass structure. But what's motivating us to do that is that beauty of scientific discovery.
This is paradise for wildlife. It's also accessible, especially New Jersey, you know. New Jersey's got a bad rap. We tell people we're coming to New Jersey and they go, oh, why are you going there? We try to tell them it's beautiful. It's like a biodiversity hotspot here. Like the fact that all these beaches are closed for a month around Delaware Bay, that's incredible.
You know, I grew up, just down the street coming down to the bay, and, the bay was always an interesting place because it wasn't like the Atlantic Coast beaches. There was dead things on the beaches, sharks, and even found a sea turtle one time. But then in spring, there were shorebirds, lots of them. The beach was cobbled with shorebirds. This was, say, back in the golden age, 20 years, 25 years ago. So back when there were a lot more red knots in the world. I can attest that they were thick here in Villas, New Jersey, home of the best sunsets.
Because Delaware Bay has the largest population of horseshoe crabs in the world. There's so many crabs that they lay so many eggs that there's eggs all over the surface of the beaches. So when the shorebirds arrive, they don't have to hunt for prey. They can just gobble up eggs and get fat. In the mid-90s, horseshoe crab numbers were very high, at numbers that no one could really imagine that there could be anything that could go wrong. It was just so many crabs. And then 5 years later, the population was almost decimated. What happened was it suddenly became valuable as bait. We had fishermen coming from everywhere trying to get crabs because they were free, they were abundant. I truly remember tractor trailers going away with horseshoe crabs. By the late 90s, there were so few crabs that the number of eggs on the surface of the beach had declined from a high of around 50,000 eggs per square meter to about 2,000 eggs per square meter. So birds coming, have no understanding what's happening before they get here. Suddenly, thousands and thousands of birds were arriving and there were no more eggs. And so they left the bay, of course, to go on to the Arctic, but there were a large number had died either on the way because they didn't have the weight, or they got to the Arctic and they died, or they just didn't breed. And so very quickly the shorebird populations crashed.
Maybe there were too many red knots before. Have you considered that?
I don't think so.
Too many for what?
I think there's too many
Just
humans.
Too many.
I think there's too many humans.
I mean, why do you need more than a handful?
So they don't go extinct.
Populations are still a quarter of what they once were. So even though we're seeing good weights and we're seeing similar populations of last year, it's still important to remember that the populations here on the bay currently are a quarter of what they were historically. And the horseshoe crab population on the bay is about also a quarter of what it was historically.
There's a couple birds from Argentina, or that were tagged in Argentina. They have an orange flag. Canada, they have white flags. Birds that are tagged in the United States will either show a lime green flag, which have a light green, or a dark green flag. Yeah, there's quite a few fly birds out here. I mean, these guys are some of the most prolific migrants in the animal kingdom. They breed in the high Arctic. Red knots breed in the high Arctic. And Rufous subspecies, which is what predominantly uses Delaware Bay and James Bay, they migrate down to as far south as Tierra del Fuego. The shorebirds as a group are showing some of the steepest declines of any avian species group. You know, this is kind of a time where we could probably do something to help them if we have a concerted effort towards conserving the key resources that these birds need. It's not insane what they require. They migrate extensive distances, and to enable that migration, they have to stop and feed at a number of key locations. And if you keep this sort of string of sites, you don't need a whole ton of them, but if you can conserve a whole set of key locations, you can enable a pretty significant level of conservation for this group.
We know from tracking devices that there are birds coming into the Delaware Bay that have flown for 6 or 7 days straight. So when they arrive in Delaware Bay, they are desperate for food. Like, you have to ask the question, well, why don't they just make shorter flights? It's easier. The reason that is the prevailing hypothesis is that birds in the Arctic are not subject to parasites and diseases that normally occur in warm weather. So the fittest strategy, the best evolutionary strategy, was to leave the Arctic and go to a place that's similar to the Arctic, like Tierra del Fuego. Before we had this disruption because of the horseshoe crab harvest and the subsequent decline, most of the birds in the population were making these 10,000-mile flights, and the smaller groups were in northern Brazil and Cuba and Florida. When we almost destroyed the horseshoe crab population, the main effect was on those long-distance birds, and the short-distance birds sort of were stable. So now we have a lot of short-distance birds and a lot less long-distance birds. The question is, because the knots listed it, are they safe? And that's what we had been fighting for. Ever since the first big declines, we've been appealing to the federal agencies to consider the listing of the red knot. Finally, last year it happened. So we assumed that that would increase the protections for red knot. But we weren't aware that there was a industry effort to expand aquaculture on Delaware Bay, and so now we have aquaculture racks starting to be put out on habitat that we know is essential to red knots.
I work on intertidal flats. At high tide, this area is under 5 or 6 or 7 feet of water, depending on the moon and the sun and the time of the year and the wind. So every day there are 2 low tides a day when these flats are exposed. And that's when I work. When the tide's dropping, that's when I go out to work. When the tide comes in, that's when I finish. So I work 7 days a week, but I also work with the tide table. The rack and bag method is something that they developed in France, and it's good where the water is very rough. Delaware Bay is calm today, but it's extremely rough all through the winter and a lot of the fall. So we can't just have them loose and flopping around. We would lose them. We have to anchor them into the bottom with our racks. They're rebar racks, 1/2-inch rebar. We buy the seed from the Rutgers Aquaculture Center, very small, and we put them in different mesh-sized bags as they grow. So what you have to do is keep changing the bags as they grow. We have to keep them clean in the summertime because the bay is so full of life that everything grows all over the bags and in the bags, and we have to keep them clean enough that the oysters don't suffocate. So it's a lot of work. It's a huge amount of work. I actually am a biologist by training, and I enjoy the puzzle of how to make it work better and what's going on in the bay and why, and I enjoy taking care of them and watching them grow into beautiful oysters. And then I love it when people buy them and tell me they're the best oysters they ever ate.
It's really across the country and all over the world. There's been a new excitement around oysters and eating oysters. We like to think of it as a renaissance. I think there's tremendous potential for oyster farming to expand in New Jersey. The market demand is certainly there. We have a fantastic oyster that will rival any oysters produced in the country. You know, it's a very important conservation issue, and I think oyster farmers are sensitive to it, as well as the conservation community and the nonprofit organizations, the state regulators, the federal regulators. And it's really about how we want to use the space where the oyster farms are occurring.
The question is, what's the problem with oyster farming on the tidal flats? It's a complicated question because one could say that there is no problem if it's done right. Like, we all like to eat oysters. Red knot biologists eat oysters just as much as everybody else, and we're happy to see the oyster aquaculture industry expand because it helps the people of this area. So there's a right way and there's a wrong way. The right way is to expand it from its current center. Right now there is a aquaculture development zone, and that's where most of the oysters are grown, about 1.3 million. But what the agencies conspired to do with Rutgers Extension and other groups was to greatly expand that area, not just make it larger, but then to sort of sprawl into all the other possible places where aquaculture could take place, far exceeding the need.
The shorebirds use the entire stretch of the Delaware Bay, just about, 45 miles of shoreline on the New Jersey side, similar amount on the Delaware side. So it's tough to site an oyster farm in an area where you wouldn't run into red knot habitat. So the next best thing we can do is manage our farm activities in a way that we minimize any disturbance to the birds.
Okay, this is where it starts to get a little complicated, but pay attention, because this part is important. It's not easy to site an oyster farm, because most homeowners don't want one disturbing their bayside view, or to deal with the noise. So, New Jersey regulators identified a 7-mile stretch of beach that is still mostly undeveloped. The agencies refer to this stretch as the action area. Currently, nearly all 1.5 million oysters farmed on the bay each year are grown in 2 clusters within the action area. The entire action area is also used by red knots during the month of May. In an attempt to balance red knot conservation with their desire to expand oyster farming, the agencies split the action area into 2 segments based on relative red knot use. As one spokesman for the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection put it, we're trying to play Solomon. In the southern segment, which is used less extensively by red knots, aquaculture will be given priority. Certain rules called conservation measures will attempt to minimize the impact of oyster farming on the birds. But overall, the expansion here could be significant. Potentially, oyster racks could cover the tidal flats for a nearly continuous stretch of more than 2 miles. In the northern segment, the conservation measures are much more restrictive, including no oyster racks at all from April 15 to June 7, the entire time red knots are in the neighborhood. Regulators believe these more onerous restrictions will mostly prevent intertidal aquaculture from expanding within the northern zone, and instead encourage it to move south. This plan has proved controversial, especially among people interested in the conservation of red knots. To conservationists, the pertinent questions are, what will be the impact of aquaculture on red knots and horseshoe crabs? And how much undisturbed habitat within the action area is needed to support a full red knot recovery? Regulators acknowledge that they don't know the answer to these questions.
So, let's be clear, right? The United States Fish and Wildlife Service's mission is to conserve the species that are listed. And the way that they do that is by using the best available science. And unfortunately, in this case, there is science, but there's not a lot of published information. This is a relatively new interaction going on. And one of the questions that we're looking at is, what is the impact of the racks themselves? Do the birds just avoid them altogether? And red knots, we don't see them in between the racks. They certainly don't go under the racks. We see them in close proximity. And this year we were able to start measuring, at least at a coarse scale, how far away individual birds were from the rack setup. But I would say, just anecdotally speaking, sure, they're more flighty.
The best available science, in my opinion, and based on my having worked with shorebirds since the 1980s, is that one, red knots are more vulnerable to human disturbance than the other shorebirds. They stay farther away from people and farther away from structures than do the other shorebirds. And what I'm most concerned about is that when you put structures on the intertidal, you take away at least that amount of habitat for foraging red knots, which is clearly in effect. The other thing we're interested in is whether or not any of these structures have an effect on the number of horseshoe crabs that come in to lay their eggs and on the egg density.
We're digging holes to sample horseshoe crab egg cluster abundance and development over time throughout the summer. I'm going to say, if I dig a hole right now, it'll be my 2023rd hole of the season. There was a, Science Friday on NPR a couple weeks ago. They were talking about how everybody uses science, for whatever they do in their day-to-day life, the scientific method. But the guy gave an example. Unless you're digging holes and filling them back in, you're probably using the scientific method. And, I take issue with that. I should have called in because I dig holes and we're definitely using the scientific method here.
I'm a bit of a moderate, right? I'm in the middle of the road, so I can see we need to develop, people need to make a living, but it seems to me we shouldn't be heavily subsidizing things through the environment, right? I think we should be able to balance it. I think people sometimes do some stupid things. They don't really think about the impact on the environment. They don't think about the longer term impact. You guys got some classics here, the cod fishery, the horseshoe crab fishery. It's rip, shit and bust, Go and strip the resource out and it doesn't really matter what happens afterwards because I've made my buck.
No one wants to see the extinction of the red knot, and no one wants to see the extinction of this oyster economy. So I think regardless of what the science says, it's really up to the folks that are living in this situation to come together and to come up with solutions that work for everyone.
This reckless expansion of just leasing out everything and then applying rules that nobody will enforce, that nobody really understands and expect that that's going to contain it, is foolhardy. And it's foolhardy because we know how these things operate on Delaware Bay and other similar estuaries, the industry gets entrenched and gets going and uses up all the resources before you can build a case to stop them.
My opinion is the conflict has basically been resolved, and it continues to make media attention because I guess controversy sells, and some of the environmental groups persist in painting us as a danger to the bay. So I think the problem is resolved, and I think there will be no huge expansion of aquaculture in the sensitive zone. And I think that's their fear, and that we'll have ATVs running everywhere, and it just isn't going to happen. It's not. I mean, the rules are already in place to not have that happen.
I think one of the questions that I'm trying to understand is, is the oyster industry interested in expanding in that southern zone exclusively, or are they also interested in expanding in the northern zone? And I think some of the conservationists I've talked to, it seems that a fear of theirs is that seems to be where the birds are the most active, and they believe that the industry wants to come to these places as well. Can you respond to that?
I'm not really sure where the basis of their fears of expansion lie. And I think that's an area where it can be controlled. If the state feels like aquaculture should not expand into those areas, they will not give the permit. I'm not worried about that. I think that's we're not going to see farms sprouting up in those areas anytime soon. I really feel like the issue with the red knot is not oyster farming in the Delaware Bay. If you read the listing documents, the justification for the listing of the red knot, oyster farming is not even raised as a threat. The red knot is up against some much bigger issues: sea level rise, climate change, loss of habitat. It's a 9,000-mile journey, I think, somewhere along that. We're talking about, 2-mile stretch of beach that the red knot uses.
The story of conflict between wildlife and economic development is an old one, and it plays out every day, all around the world. On the Delaware Bay, I found a lot of disagreement about the conflict between red knots and oyster farming. Many conservationists believe the threat to red knots is significant. Many on the industry side say the threat is minimal. What's the truth? Good question. For now, the truth is hidden because there is still much science to be done. This is also a familiar story. Groups of people must make important decisions with only incomplete information to go by. And what's at stake? In this case, it's money, some jobs, and the existence of a rather remarkable bird. In New Jersey, the value of oysters farmed in the Delaware Bay is about $1 million per year. The value of the horseshoe crab harvest that hurt the red knot so significantly was probably less than $300,000 per year. The value of ecotourism generated from birdwatching has been estimated at millions of dollars per year. But what is the true value of a red knot? That's another good question. The answer, I'd have to say, is entirely subjective. But here is a firm fact to leave you with. The Delaware Bay remains one of the world's most important stopover sites for migratory shorebirds. Next May, birds will come to the bay and rely on its resources for their survival, just as they have for a very long time.